Glenys Heyward was a woman who found joy in the simple things. She loved her garden, tending to her plants with a gentle hand that seemed to coax life from the soil. Friends remember her as warm, kind, and generous, a person who would always offer a cup of tea and a listening ear. She was a mother of 2 sons, a role she cherished above all others. Her life, on the surface, appeared ordinary. Nestled in the quiet community of Mount Gambier in South Australia, she had dreams of a peaceful retirement, of spending more time with her grandchildren, and of finally being free to live life on her own terms, away from the shadows that had loomed over her for so long. But beneath this veneer of suburban tranquility lay a story of immense struggle and quiet courage. Glenys had spent decades navigating a life that was far from peaceful. She was a survivor, a woman who had endured unimaginable hardship within the walls of her own home. Her strength was not loud or boastful. It was a quiet, resilient force that carried her through years of pain. Those who knew her best saw glimpses of this strength in her determination to protect her sons, and in her unwavering hope for a better future, a future where she could finally feel safe and at peace in her own space. Glenys had a deep connection to her community and her family. She was more than just a victim. She was a vibrant individual with a rich inner life. She was a daughter, a sister, and a friend. Her laughter, though perhaps heard less often in her later years, was said to be infectious. She had a knack for making people feel comfortable, for creating a sense of home wherever she was. It is this woman, the gardener, the mother, the friend, that those who loved her hold on to. They remember her not for the tragic end she met, but for the light she brought into their lives during her 63 years. The tragedy of Glenys Heyward's story is that her life was cut short just as she was beginning to reclaim it. After years of living under a cloud of fear, she had taken the brave steps to separate from her husband and build a new life for herself. She was on the cusp of the freedom she had long yearned for, a testament to her enduring spirit. Her story is a heartbreaking reminder that the most dangerous time for a victim of domestic abuse can be when they finally decide to leave. For Glenys, the promise of a new beginning was cruelly and violently stolen from her. For nearly 4 decades, Glenys Heyward's life was controlled by her husband, Neil. Their marriage was not a partnership built on love and respect, but a dictatorship ruled by his temper and his fists. The abuse was not a secret, but a grim reality known to many in their circle. It was a relentless pattern of physical, emotional, and financial control that systematically stripped Glenys of her independence and her voice. Friends and family would later recount stories of Neil's explosive anger, of his demeaning words, and of the fear that was a constant presence in the Heyward home. The violence was a dark undercurrent that shaped every aspect of their family life. The abuse was both overt and insidious. Neil Heyward was a man who needed to be in command, and he used violence to maintain his authority. Glenys suffered broken bones and countless bruises, injuries she often tried to hide or explain away. But beyond the physical assaults, there was a campaign of psychological torment. He controlled the family's finances, leaving Glenys with little personal freedom. He isolated her from friends and even family, ensuring that his influence was the most dominant in her life. This isolation is a classic tactic of abusers, designed to make the victim feel completely dependent and helpless, with nowhere to turn for support. Over the years, the constant stress and fear took a heavy toll on Glenys. She lived in a state of high alert, always trying to anticipate Neil's moods and avoid triggering his rage. This is an exhausting way to live, a psychological prison that confines the spirit just as much as physical walls. Her sons grew up in this toxic environment, witnessing their mother's suffering and learning to navigate their father's volatile behavior. The home that should have been a sanctuary was instead a place of tension and danger, a reality that would have a profound and lasting impact on everyone in the family. Despite the decades of fear, Glenys never lost her desire for a life free from violence. In the years before her death, she began to take small but significant steps to regain her autonomy. She started to reconnect with people and build a support network outside of Neil's control. Her decision to finally separate from him was an act of immense bravery, a declaration that she would no longer tolerate the abuse. It was a step towards the light, a reclaiming of her own life. Tragically, this courageous move would ultimately set in motion the horrific events that led to her death. The decades of abuse perpetrated by Neil Heyward did more than just harm Glenys. They poisoned the entire family structure, creating deep and painful divisions. The family was split into factions, a direct result of Neil's manipulative behaviour. On one side stood Glenys and her younger son, Jimmy Valentine. Gimli had witnessed his father's cruelty his entire life and was fiercely protective of his mother. He had long since distanced himself from his father, choosing to support Glenys in her quest for a life free from fear. Their bond was one of mutual support in the face of shared trauma. On the other side were Neil and his elder son, Matthew Heyward. Matthew's relationship with his father was complex and, ultimately, destructive. He appeared to have been drawn into his father's sphere of influence, perhaps through a combination of fear, loyalty, and manipulation. Neil had a powerful hold over Matthew, convincing him to see his mother as the problem. This division was not accidental. It was a calculated strategy by Neil to isolate Glenys further, even from her own child. By turning Matthew against his mother, Neil created an ally within the family, strengthening his own position and making Glenys even more vulnerable. The family home and other assets became the battleground on which this conflict played out. When Glenys finally left Neil, she rightfully sought her share of the property they had accumulated over their long marriage. This was not an act of greed, but a necessary step to secure her own future and independence. However, Neil viewed this as the ultimate betrayal. He could not stand the thought of losing control over Glenys, and he certainly could not stomach the idea of losing what he considered to be his assets. This property dispute became the focal point of his rage and resentment. This toxic dynamic placed Matthew in an impossible position, caught between his parents. His father fed him a narrative of victimhood, painting Glenys as a vindictive woman trying to ruin him financially. Neil's manipulation was relentless, preying on Matthew's loyalties and warping his perception of reality. Instead of seeing his mother as a victim of lifelong abuse seeking a safe future, Matthew began to see her as an antagonist. This tragic shift in allegiance, carefully orchestrated by Neil, would have devastating consequences. It set the stage for an unthinkable act of betrayal, turning a son against his own mother in the most final way imaginable. The manipulation of Matthew Heyward by his father was a slow and methodical process of psychological conditioning. Neil systematically poisoned his son's mind against Glenys, framing her attempts to secure her financial future as a personal attack. He presented himself as the victim, a man being wronged by a greedy ex-wife. In this twisted narrative, Glenys's fight for a fair settlement was portrayed as an act of aggression that threatened to leave them both with nothing. Matthew, already enmeshed in a complicated relationship with his controlling father, became susceptible to this distorted view of the situation. He was no longer seeing his mother, but an obstacle to his and his father's financial security. As the legal proceedings over the property settlement progressed, Neil's desperation grew, and so did his pressure on Matthew. He convinced his son that they were facing financial ruin and that drastic action was the only solution. The plan he concocted was monstrous in its simplicity. If Glenys were gone, the property dispute would disappear with her. It was a cold, calculated solution to what he saw as a financial problem. He needed an accomplice, someone he could trust and control, and he found one in his own son. Matthew's loyalty was tragically misplaced, siding with his abuser father against his victim mother. The recruitment of a co-conspirator came in the form of Jeremy Minter, a family friend. Minter was also drawn into the plot, likely through a combination of persuasion and financial incentive. Together, Neil, Matthew, and Jeremy Minter began to plan Glenys's murder. They discussed logistics, methods, and alibis, turning the abstract idea into a concrete and horrifying plan. The level of premeditation was chilling. This was not a crime of passion committed in a moment of rage, but a carefully orchestrated conspiracy to eliminate a woman for financial gain. The betrayal was now absolute and complete. For Matthew, this was the ultimate point of no return. he made a conscious choice to participate in a plot to end his own mother's life. It's a decision that defies comprehension, a testament to the powerful and corrosive effects of long-term domestic abuse on an entire family. The father-son relationship, which should be a source of strength and guidance, became a conduit for murder. Matthew's involvement transformed a family dispute into a criminal conspiracy, sealing his mother's fate and forever defining his own life by this singular, monstrous act of betrayal. He chose his father's lies over his mother's life. On the evening of May 23, 2017, the horrifying plan was set into motion. Matthew Heyward and Jeremy Minter drove to Glenys's home in Wangoom, a small town just outside Warrnambool in Victoria, where she had moved to start her new life. They knew she would be alone. They arrived under the cover of darkness, their intentions hidden from the quiet world around them. Glenys, likely believing she was finally safe in her new home, would have had no reason to suspect the danger that was approaching. The betrayal was about to be delivered to her doorstep by her own son. Using a key that Matthew had, the two men let themselves into her house. The details of what happened next are brutal and heartbreaking. They found Glenys inside her home, a place that was meant to be her sanctuary. There was a violent struggle. Glenys, a woman in her 60s, fought for her life against two younger men. They overpowered her, and using a cord, they strangled her. It was a cruel and intimate act of violence, the culmination of years of hatred and a cold-blooded desire for financial gain. Her life was extinguished in a place she had chosen to feel secure. After the murder, Matthew and Minter attempted to make it look like a suicide. They moved her body and staged the scene, a desperate and callous attempt to cover their tracks and deflect suspicion. This act shows a profound lack of remorse, a clinical focus on escaping the consequences of their actions. They left her there, her body to be discovered later, and returned to their lives as if nothing had happened. The coldness of their actions is difficult to fathom. They had not just killed a woman, they had tried to erase the truth of her murder, adding another layer of cruelty to their crime. The discovery of Glenys's body sent shockwaves through the community and her family. For her son Gimli, the news was devastating. While the staged scene initially pointed towards suicide, investigators quickly became suspicious. The signs of a struggle and the nature of her injuries did not align with the scene they found. The truth, which was far more sinister, began to slowly unravel as police dug deeper into the turbulent family history and the acrimonious property dispute. The final violent moments of Glenys Heyward's life were not an act of despair, but an act of murder. The motive for the murder of Glenys Heyward was starkly simple and honestly deeply chilling greed. At the heart of this tragedy was a bitter dispute over family assets valued at several $1 million. For decades, Neil Heyward had controlled the family's finances, and he just could not accept the idea of losing a significant portion of that wealth to Glenys in their divorce settlement. He saw the property not as a shared asset accumulated over a lifetime together, but as his alone. Glenys's claim to her rightful share was, in his mind, an unforgivable transgression that threatened his financial dominance and his sense of control. This was not just about money, it was about power. For an abuser like Neil, control is paramount. The divorce proceedings represented a profound loss of control over Glenys. She was no longer under his thumb, and the legal system was poised to validate her independence by awarding her a fair settlement. This was an affront to his entire worldview. By murdering her, he believed he could solve two problems at once. He would stop the legal process in its tracks, thereby protecting his assets, and he would enact the ultimate final act of control over the woman who had dared to leave him. Neil Heyward successfully convinced his son Matthew that he too stood to lose. He likely framed the situation as Glenys taking money that would one day be Matthew's inheritance. He manipulated Matthew into believing that his own financial future was at risk, turning a son's natural concern for his inheritance into a motive for murder. This financial fear, carefully stoked by Neil, was powerful enough to override the natural bond between a son and his mother. Matthew and his accomplice, Jeremy Minter, were not just acting on Neil's orders. They were acting in what they had been led to believe was their own financial self-interest. The police investigation systematically uncovered this financial motive. By examining the family's financial records and the ongoing legal battle, a clear picture emerged. The timing of the murder, occurring as the property settlement loomed, was no coincidence. It was a calculated business decision for Neil Heyward, with his estranged wife's life being the price he was willing to pay. The plan was to eliminate the legal opponent, absorb her share of the assets, and continue on as if she never mattered. It was a motive devoid of any human emotion except for the cold, hard calculus of greed. The police investigation was methodical. Despite the initial attempt to stage the scene as a suicide, forensic evidence and inconsistencies in the story quickly led detectives to suspect foul play. Their attention soon focused on the acrimonious relationship between Glenys and Neil, and the deep divisions within the family. Mobile phone records, witness statements, and financial documents began to weave a compelling narrative of conspiracy. Matthew Heyward and Jeremy Minter were identified as key suspects, and the web of lies they had constructed began to fall apart under the scrutiny of the investigation. In February 2020, the case went to trial. Matthew Heyward and Jeremy Minter both pleaded not guilty to the charge of murder. The prosecution laid out its case, detailing the years of abuse Glenys had suffered, the bitter financial dispute, and the cold-blooded planning that went into her killing. The jury heard testimony from friends and family, including Glenys's distraught son, Glenys Valentine. The evidence was overwhelming. After a lengthy trial, the jury delivered its verdict. Both Matthew Heyward and Jeremy Minter were found guilty of the murder of Glenys Heyward. Matthew was sentenced to 32 years in prison, while Minter received a 29-year sentence. The mastermind of the plot, however, would never face a jury. As the police investigation closed in on him in the weeks following the murder, Neil Heyward knew his time was up. Faced with the certainty of being arrested and held accountable for his lifetime of cruelty and for orchestrating his wife's murder, he chose to escape justice. He took his own life, a final, selfish act that denied Glenys and her loved ones the opportunity to see him face the consequences of his actions in a court of law. His suicide was an admission of guilt, but it was also a final act of control, denying the world the chance to hold him publicly responsible. The convictions of Matthew and Minter brought a measure of legal closure to the case, but it could never undo the damage. Justice was served, but it came at an immense cost. A family was irrevocably destroyed, one son complicit in his mother's murder, the other left to grieve the loss of his entire immediate family. The legal outcomes confirmed the horrific truth of what had happened, but they also laid bare the profound tragedy of a family so thoroughly broken by domestic violence that it had culminated in the most unnatural of crimes. For Glenys Valentine, the murder of his mother was not the end of his nightmare, but the beginning of a lifetime of grief. He lost not only his beloved mother, but, in a single brutal act, his brother and father as well. His father, the architect of the tragedy, took his own life. His brother, Matthew, was revealed to be his mother's killer, a betrayal so profound it is nearly impossible to comprehend. Glenys was left utterly alone, an orphan of a family conflict that had spiraled into unimaginable violence. The courtroom verdicts provided a legal conclusion, but they could not heal the deep, complex wounds of his loss. The emotional toll on Glenys has been immense. He has had to navigate a world without the person who was his staunchest ally, his mother. He has been forced to reconcile the memory of the brother he grew up with the man who conspired to murder their mother for money. This is a psychological burden that few can imagine. In public statements and interviews, he has spoken with incredible dignity and strength about his love for his mother and the pain of his loss. He has become the keeper of her memory, ensuring she is remembered as the kind, loving woman she was, not just as a victim. The aftermath of the murder also highlighted the stark division that Neil Heyward had cultivated for years. While Glenys had always stood by his mother, he was now forced to confront the reality that his brother had chosen the other side in the most final and violent way possible. The family was not just divided, it was annihilated. the bonds of brotherhood were dissolved by greed and murder. Gimeli's grief is compounded by this sense of betrayal, a pain that goes beyond simple loss and enters a realm of deep personal injury inflicted by his own flesh and blood. Surviving such a tragedy requires an incredible amount of resilience. Gimeli has had to find a way to move forward while carrying the weight of his family's dark history. He has become an advocate in his own way for understanding the devastating ripple effects of domestic violence. His journey is a powerful testament to the unseen victims of these crimes: the children, the siblings, the friends who are left behind to pick up the pieces. His story is a heartbreaking reminder that when a life is taken by domestic violence, the devastation extends far beyond the initial act, leaving permanent scars on the lives of all who are left behind. The tragic tale of Glenys Heyward is a devastating illustration of the ultimate consequences of domestic violence. It serves as a stark and painful lesson about the critical importance of robust support systems for victims. For decades, Glenys endured abuse in relative isolation, a common experience for many victims who are controlled and cut off from help by their abusers. Her story underscores the urgent need for communities to be vigilant, for friends and family to offer non-judgmental support, and for accessible resources to be available for those trying to escape violent situations. A simple question or a safe offer of help can be a lifeline. This case also reveals the corrosive power of domestic abuse on the entire family unit. Neil Heyward's violence and manipulation did not just harm Glenys. It warped his son Matthew's morality, turning him into a murderer. It shows how the cycle of violence and control can poison relationships and lead to unthinkable outcomes. Educating young people about healthy relationships and the signs of abuse is crucial in preventing such tragedies. We must foster a culture where violence is never seen as a solution and where empathy is valued above control. The destruction of the Heyward family is a testament to the failure to break this cycle. One of the most critical takeaways from Glenys's story is that leaving an abuser is often the most dangerous time for a victim. Glenys was killed not while she was compliant, but when she was fighting for her freedom and independence. This highlights the need for comprehensive safety planning for anyone leaving a violent relationship. Support services, law enforcement, and the legal system must work together to protect victims during this vulnerable period. Restraining orders, emergency housing, and legal aid are not just helpful. They are essential tools that can mean the difference between life and death. Ultimately, Glenys Heyward should be remembered not just for the tragedy of her death, but for the courage she showed in trying to build a new life. Her story compels us to do better. We must listen to victims, believe them, and take their fears seriously. We must hold abusers accountable for their actions and challenge the societal norms that allow domestic violence to fester in silence. By learning from this heartbreaking loss, we can work towards a future where no one else has to suffer the same fate, and where everyone has the right to live a life free from fear and violence. It is the very least we owe to the memory of Glenys.